My channel is about to enter a phase this winter of catching up on old video footage and projects that people have been asking me about for forever, but which, for one reason or another, I just never got around to and then eventually moved on from. The first up is this plaid circle skirt. I made it right after New Year's in 2020, so right at 4 years ago, and I immediately started working on the video, but my editing skills just weren't good enough to make the video I was envisioning at the time. I got stuck, got frustrated, and eventually gave up. But I kept all of that original footage. I'm explaining all of this because the filming location is 2 houses back in time, and the tools I had available then were different. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I made the skirt mostly by hand. I used a basic modern sewing machine for certain parts, but it was very simple to construct, and I feel like it could make a very good beginner-friendly skirt tutorial. Maybe not your very first skirt, but like your second or your third skirt. So let's see what we've got. For the design, I wanted to make something worthy of this vintage wool plaid I had found on Etsy. It wasn't a fabric shop. It was somebody simply cleaning out their grandmother's stash, and I bought this not quite 2-yard chunk as is. I believe it cost around $15 or $20, but I don't remember exactly. I knew that I wanted it to be a full circle skirt, but I also wanted to do something fun, like give it some unique detailing. Looking at vintage skirts on Pinterest, I was struck by the cool patterns sometimes used around the pockets. I really liked this one in particular. And I was also just getting into 18th century costuming at that time, so I thought maybe I could do some sort of a hybrid 18th century pocket with this design. For another cool detail, I really liked the idea of suspenders, but I love versatile designs that can be worn multiple ways. I got an idea from the way these tabs were buttoned down over the tops of the pockets. I thought, what if I made tabs like this, but they were belt loops, and they buttoned down at the base of the waistband? They could be unbuttoned and flipped around to the inside, leaving just the buttons where I could attach suspenders if I wanted. In the next part, I'm going to very thoroughly, in great detail, explain how to cut out a circle skirt. But if you've done that before, or if you've seen my video on patterning any kind of flared skirt, feel free to skip through this next part. You need a pretty large, preferably wide chunk of fabric to do this, but you can also always piece narrower fabric together. In this case, there was barely enough with the piece that I had. Start by folding your fabric into neat, even quarters. I lined up the plaid weave to make sure that everything was perfectly straight. Now let's visualize it. Your fabric looks like this, and you will be cutting out a circle that looks like this. But we folded our fabric into quarters to simplify things and to make it easier to get everything cut evenly. So you will actually be cutting out a shape that looks like this. The center of the circle is the corner of the fold. Now we need to employ a bit of basic 5th grade geometry. R equals C over 2 pi. C means circumference, the length of the path around the full circle. 2 means 2, and pi means 3.14159 to infinity. R means radius, the distance from the center of the circle to the edge, and that is the number that we need to find. C, the circumference, is simply your waist measurement. Measure yourself, wrapping the tape comfortably around your waist. You can make it a little bit loose for the ease of wearing. The number I came up with was 28. 28 is the circumference of this inner circle here. So, plug that into the formula, and you can very simply enter it into a calculator. 28 divided by, in parentheses, 2 times pi. I came up with 4.4563, which we'll call 4.5 inches. You can do that in centimeters if you need to, the formula is just the same. So now we know that the radius of this circle is 4.5 inches. Except actually it's not. This is very important and a lot of beginners forget this. You need seam allowance. If you cut the circle here at 4.5 inches, by the time you sew it to a waistband, you'll find that you've actually sewn a circle with a radius of 5 inches, which means that the circumference will end up being 31 inches, not 28. Do not forget your seam allowance. Take this number, 4.5, and subtract ½ inch from it. That gives me 4 inches. Now let's cut it. Line up a string with the folded corner of your fabric. Tape it down, but just make sure that it's secure and doesn't slip. Measure out your radius, 4 inches in my case, and tie a knot in the string just there. Now see how it swings across the fabric? It creates a perfect curve. Slowly swing the string over your fabric, marking at least every inch. Now you can cut it. Whew, hard part's over. Next is the outer circle. This is the hem, or how long you want the skirt to be. You can calculate this with some simple addition. Hold a tape measure at your waist and stand in front of a full-length mirror. Decide how long you want the skirt to be and write down that number. Add a 1/2 inch to account for the seam allowance at the top, and add some more for the hem allowance. Let's say 1 inch. So take the total of those numbers and measure out from your first knot, making a second knot. That is the technical way to do it. However, that's assuming that you have an unlimited amount of fabric, which I don't. Instead, I simply held out the string to the nearest edge of my folded fabric and tied a knot there. I didn't have a specific length in mind, I just wanted to use the maximum possible amount of fabric. Again, if I had more fabric, I could have sewn a strip onto the short side, piecing it together and allowing for a longer skirt, but I didn't, so I didn't. Like with the first circle, I'm going to swing the knot in an arc over my fabric, marking it every so often. Then I cut it out. Congratulations, you have the base of a circle skirt. I also cut out the other pieces at that time, but I'll go over them as I get to the sewing of each one. I'm gonna give you a heads up. For the sewing of the skirt, I made it 4 years ago, so I don't exactly remember what I was thinking, but I think we can assume that I was just making things up as I went, and I didn't really have a plan. Reviewing the footage, I have no idea why I did it in the order that I did. Some of this footage I'm going to reorganize, explaining the tutorial in the order that I should have done it. So if my sleeves keep inexplicably changing color, that's why. But other things I can't simply reorder, so I'll have to explain as we go and tell you what I should have done. I started with the closure, the placket down the back of the skirt where it will open and close. I cut out a strip of my wool that was 2 3/4 of an inch wide and generously long. I wanted a finish opening that would be 6 inches deep. So in the center back of my skirt, I cut a slit 6 1/2 inches long, the extra 1/2 inch being for seam allowance. I'm following the plaid design to keep everything perfectly straight. Then I started pinning the edge of my placket to each side of the opening, matching up the stripes on each piece. In the center, you have to start pulling the skirt away from the placket edge slightly in order to smooth the fabric down and keep it from bubbling and tucking when you sew. Try to pull the base of the split right to just inside where you'll be sewing, which in this case is 1/4 inch. Stitch down this edge, staying at 1/4 inch. Most of the time I use a 1/2 inch for seam allowances, but here we want the seam to be as invisible as possible and to reduce the fabric waste by as little as possible. We are still losing a 1/2 inch, so actually you should probably factor that into your waist circumference when you're first cutting out your skirt, which I definitely forgot to do. If you stitch it correctly, at the end you should have no tucks or bubbles, just a nice smooth curve. This is definitely easier to achieve with thick, meshy fabric like the wool that I'm using here. I especially liked the way the lines all matched up to make this perfect triangle. At the ironing board, you'll press everything very well, flattening the seams towards the placket. See how it narrows at the base? Now I'm ironing over a 1/2 inch of the other side of the placket. Then I'm going to fold that edge over to match the stitching, lining up all of the stripes once more and pinning it down. I hand stitched that side using an invisible slip stitch. And here's what it looked like. Very nice. Now the pockets. This was the most complicated part of the project, but it didn't even need to be. I was making things up as I went, and I did some very nonsensical things. So I wanted to have this kind of decorative triangular placket on the outside, and a big 18th century pocket on the inside. I started by drafting a basic 18th century pocket shape. It's quite large, almost 18 inches long, and in the center I drew a line 8 1/2 inches long. This is for an 8-inch pocket opening, plus a 1/2 inch for seam allowance. I cut out a pair of pockets from my wool, one at a time, lining them up so that the plaid matched perfectly and so that a narrow stripe ran down the center of each pocket. Then I cut out another pair for the pocket linings. I didn't have enough wool for another set, and I didn't really want to use wool here because I wanted to reduce the bulky layers, so this pair I cut from a brown hapatoy silk, though you could use just about anything. For the decorative placket, I largely used the stripes of the plaid to determine things. I drew the pocket opening, 8 1/2 inches down the center of one stripe, then I measured out a long pentagrammic shape around that line, matching up the placement of the stripes on each side of the placket. The chalk markings will be my seams, so I cut it out eyeballing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then I cut a second identical placket out of more wool. At the ironing board, I folded down the seam allowances on the long sides and the base of each placket, leaving the top edge raw as it will be sewn up into the waistband later on. Then I started sewing the pocket, lining, and back together. I sewed them with a French seam, which means that I lined them up wrong sides together, sewed about 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and then I trimmed that edge down by half and clipped the round corners. Then I turned it wrong side out, I pinned it, and sewed around it for a second time at 1/4 of an inch. Then I could sew the plackets on. I turned it wrong sides together again and temporarily pinned around the edges just to keep them flat while I worked on the placket. I pinned the plackets down the center where the pocket opening will be, and then I sewed around that line. Do you see how dumb this was? If I hadn't sewn the pocket backs on yet, this would have been super easy, but no. Instead, I had to scrunch it up and try to reach around the base without sewing through the wrong silk anywhere. This is the line that I was trying to sew around. Anyways, after that, I cut down the center of the pocket slit, opening it up. Then I could turn the pocket right side out again. I lined up the pockets on the inside of the skirt, trying it on to make sure that the pocket was hanging straight. The hard thing here was making sure that they both matched perfectly with the diagonal off-bias plaid. You probably noticed that the waistband was already sewn on in these clips. That was another dumb thing I did that complicated everything, so don't worry, we'll get back to the waistband. Before I even sewed this bit, I went ahead and cut the skirt down that pocket slit. There was just no way that I could have stitched around it without doing this. I lined up the pins on either side and then sewed it around the silk again, right on top of my previous stitching. I clipped to the corners at the base, and then I folded the placket to the outside, flattened it, and pinned around the slit and the edges. I'm leaving the slit alone for now, but I am slip stitching around the outer edges of the plackets, a nice invisible stitch to tack them down. So, just a rundown because I'm sure that was confusing to the beginners out there. Here's how I should have done the pocket. On the back side of the skirt, stack up first the silk lining and then the decorative placket, making sure that the markings for the slit are all perfectly lined up. Stitch around the slit and then cut it open and clip to the corners to make a little triangle. Then turn the placket out to the front of the skirt and stitch the edges down. Now on the inside, add the pocket back. A French seam like I did is not the best option. It would be better to just stitch flat around the pocket and then cover that seam with a strip of bias tape, which you could even cut out from your pocket lining fabric to match perfectly. Those steps will make the exact same pocket just much simpler and easier. Now to make the little pointed tabs for the belt loops. I plan to make the waistband 1 1/4 inches wide, so to wrap around that, the tabs will need to be doubled, plus seam allowance, plus extra for the point. I rounded all that out to be about 4 inches long and 2 inches wide. I needed 4 tabs, so I cut out 8 pieces, following the stripe pattern to make sure that they all matched perfectly. I paired them up and pinned them. I didn't add markings to the stitching because I planned to follow the stripes and the intersections of the plaid. I stitched around 4 sides, and then trimmed down the edges, cutting closer but not too close around the corners. Then I turned them right side out, using a bamboo knitting needle to gently push out the corners. If you do this too roughly, you will poke a hole through your fabric. I finished by ironing them flat. For the waistband, I cut 2 strips. My finished waistband is going to be 28 inches, and I need an extra inch for the width of the closure placket, and another inch for seam allowance, so 30 inches. And I want the waistband to be 1 1/4 inches wide, so I'll add 1 inch for seam allowances, 2 1/4 inches. Usually I make waistbands as one piece, simply folded down at the top without a seam. I'm not sure why I did a seam at the top here. It's possible that I just didn't have enough fabric. I lined up the tabs on the inside of the skirt because remember, they're going to be folding up and over the waistband. Then I placed 1 strip of the waistband on either side of the edge, 1 on the inside, 1 on the outside. I was careful lining up the stripes so that the center one would be just right at the center of the skirt and one would be over each pocket slit. You know what? That's why I sewed the waistband on first, so that I could line up the pockets with a stripe. Okay, it was still harder to do it that way, but at least I'm glad that I did it for a reason. I stitched the back edges of the waistband first, and then I fiddled around with them, trying to make the stripes line up so that they formed a continuous band around the waist. Then I sewed across the waistline. And yes, it was very satisfying how the stripes line up. I was having a lot of fun with that, maybe too much fun. Then I sewed over the corners, reinforcing them. And then, before I folded the waistband up, I trimmed down the selvages a bit. However, I didn't trim them all down as one piece. I trimmed each layer separately, staggering them so that they wouldn't form a hard ridge that would show through the waistband. At the ironing board, I folded and ironed down a 1/2 inch on the front and the back of the waistband. Then I folded both edges up and lined up the stripes, pinning them together. I sewed them with a slip stitch and we're nearly done, down to the fun stuff. Well, almost down to the fun stuff. I forgot I still have the hem to do. I started by ironing down a 1/2 inch, and then folding the edge over by 1 inch and pinning it, working in wide sections. You see how much it bubbles up? With curved hems like this, I usually do a very narrow hem that's about 1/4 inch. This is because when you sew it on the sewing machine, all of those bubbles can form really ugly puckers and twists. Making the hem as narrow as possible minimizes this. However, I was planning to hand stitch this hem, which allows you so much more control over your stitching. Even a full inch-wide hem like this turned out perfectly, with no trace of bubbling or puckering. Okay, now for the fun details. Buttons. I had these beautiful little etched coconut buttons from Joann's. I believe they still carry this exact button, at least I saw it in store recently. A button will be sewn down to the very edge of the waistband at the top of the pocket slit. I used a bright goldenrod yellow embroidery floss for this. And then another button will be sewn at the middle side back, opposite of the tab on the inside. From there I began to hand stitch a nice bold running stitch down the edge of the pocket slit. At the base of the slit, I transitioned the running stitch into a narrow blanket stitch, which I hoped would reinforce the edges, as well as providing another little detail for visual interest. Then I continued the running stitch back up the other side. I outlined each tab with more running stitches, and then at the end, I cut a slit and made a hand-worked buttonhole using the same embroidery floss. This is another thing that I would have done in a different order if I'd really been thinking. There was no reason to wait until the end for this, and the ends of the embroidery floss would have been much easier to hide if I'd done it earlier. And then I finished it off with 2 hook and eyes at the back of the waistband and 2 snaps on the placket. Now for an accessory, the suspenders. Following the stripes, I cut out lots of 2-inch wide strips. I didn't have nearly enough fabric left to not have to piece them, but that's alright. I sewed together the strips, trying to keep the front ones all lined up perfectly. For the lining pieces, I didn't care that much. I matched 2 strips up, right sides together. I sewed around both points and then stopped, leaving a few inch gap to turn them right side out through. I trimmed down around the points and turned them right side out. After ironing and slip stitching the opening closed, I did decorative running stitches all the way around the suspenders, gave them buttonholes, and then I tried them on and pinned together the suspenders where they crossed over in the back. I sewed a diamond shape around that cross section, stitching right through my previous running stitches, and then hiding my stitches wherever there weren't running stitches. And that was that. All of my qualms and mistakes with this skirt can mostly be chalked up to the poorly thought out way I went about the construction. However, those things didn't end up negatively affecting the final garment. They just frustrated me while I was working on it, and possibly even more so while editing this video. But the final piece is beautiful. For a simple daily wear garment, it's one of the pieces I'm most proud of. However, there was one simple mistake I made that I have not told you about yet. When I was sewing on the waistband, I was making a big deal about lining up the stripes. I was actually paying more attention to that than I was the measurements. In order to make the stripes match up perfectly in the back, I eased in the skirt fabric more than I realized. I think I accidentally took off about a 1/2 inch from each side, which didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but I also lost a 1/2 inch with the back placket. That's a total of 1.5 inches. At that time, my waist fluctuated between 27 and 27.5 inches, so I'd planned for a 28-inch waistband for some ease. But I wound up with a 26.5-inch waistband. Beneath that 27 inches, I didn't have a lot of squishable fat. I pretty much just have rib cage, so it was wearable, but never comfortable. And in the years since, my waist has drifted to a 28.5-inch fluctuation, and now it's just not wearable. I always kind of thought I'd go back and redo it someday, but now I find that I'm gravitating towards more size-adjustable designs and longer hemlines, and I think I'd rather just save this skirt as a keepsake and make a new version. I have made a pattern for this skirt. As you've seen, for the original skirt, I relied heavily on following the plaid design of my fabric and measured very little. The hardest part was lining things up without actual markings, so I've rectified that with my patterned version. It is now available on Patreon, along with the other patterns that I've made this year. It was very interesting to go through this footage with 4 more years of experience. The biggest thing I noticed is that, damn, I used to try hard. All of the makeup, the Bernadette hairstyle, trying to remember to change up my camera angles, but also the sewing. Debilitating perfectionism, to the point where I made a huge mistake just because I forgot that the waistband actually had to fit me. At the time I made the skirt, I had already begun to try to transition my wardrobe into handmade clothing, but this project perfectly illustrates why I just wasn't able to do it for so long. Look at this plaid skirt compared to the skirts that I made this year. This year's skirts are almost completely machine sewn, and most of them took me a day to make. It's true that they don't have nearly as much character or style, but they are wearable. It's only been after I've let go of that perfectionism that I've actually been able to break through that barrier and just make fun stuff. This past summer is the first year out of 5 that I've finally started wearing my own clothes in majority, and that I've finally been able to get rid of some of my ratty old dresses. And I just could have hit that mark so much sooner if I hadn't wasted so much time on elaborate, fancy projects that I just wasn't even planning out well. I'm not saying that nobody should sew like this, or that it's a waste of time to put that much care and effort into a garment. I'd actually really like to get back to that place again. But I am saying that you don't have to sew like that. Don't feel pressured because people online make their stuff look like it's always so perfect, at least long enough for them to get a few pretty pictures. We have bigger goals and bigger priorities than just making something look good for the internet, and perfect sewing is an illusion and a mental trap that's just not helpful. Okay, how about we go check on the chickens? Well, I decided not to film a new chicken update today, mostly because it's just raining and gray and so dreary outside. Meanwhile, last Saturday we had our first snowfall, and it was the most beautiful winter day you can imagine, so I took some clips then. For Christmas, Caleb got me an automatic chicken door opener, which will be a really great thing when we go on short trips, because the chickens will be safe at night without us there locking and opening the door for them. This one in particular has a safety feature when it's shutting, to where it only closes halfway and then it pauses for 10 seconds before finishing the closure, which is amazing because one of the reasons I didn't want to get a chicken door before this is because I've seen online horror stories where a chicken has been sleeping in the doorway and then the door shut and the chicken didn't get out of the way in time and it got squished. But this one, it closes to a narrow enough gap that it's not going to harm the chicken, but it will definitely make them move. What I got for Caleb for Christmas was, well, you'll see.
What?
Merry Christmas!
Oh my God.
From Mariah.
Oh. Oh.
Well, thank you guys.
Oh.
He always wanted to be a part of it.
Oh.
What?
Let me
So we got a cat?
Oh.
That's a cat.
Oh, let me see.
Oh my gosh. She's a feisty little woman.
Let me see. He's a
Okay.
She's
Aw.
4 months old.
Oh. Let's see your little face.
Is it a little girl cat?
Mm-hmm.
Aww. It's got little specs. Hi.
How long have you guys been playing this?
Wow, we just kept playing dice.
Wow.
Aww.
Oh, that's why I was like, okay.
It's
very sweet.
Gosh, cat.
Caleb is a major cat person. He begged for a kitten when he was a little kid, and he never got one until he was older. They got a 1-year-old cat. But then when he moved out, he had to leave the cat behind, and then shortly after, he started dating me, and I'm so not a cat person. Oh my gosh, why do people love cats? I don't get it. So he was always making comments about how much he misses having a cat and he loves cats and he wishes we could get a cat someday. And I've been like, I see no reason to ever own a cat unless we have a mouse problem. Well, guess what? We've got a mouse problem. So I got him this 4-month-old cat for Christmas. He named her Jinx. And as far as cats go, she's pretty good. She does drive me a little bit crazy, but we're planning on keeping her an indoor cat through the rest of this winter while she's still young, and then when spring hits, we'll start letting her out a little bit during the days so that she can get to know the chickens, run around outside, and then we're planning to put a cat door in the basement so that she can always get into safety and out of the weather. And that's pretty much the plan right now. But this winter he'll be able to enjoy her, and I don't hate her. It's enjoyable watching them play together and when she snuggles with us, but also I'm the one who works from home, so I'm the one who's home with her all day long, and she is young enough that she's very, very demanding of attention. Anyways, so yeah, we got a cat. All right, goodbye.